of folks who are here for this third session in our series with BIRCH related to how to translate evidence to policy. The session today is about writing and disseminating policy briefs, and we will have one main speaker joined by another speaker along the way, Dr. Nancy Ngumbau, who I will introduce in a moment, and then Dr. Cyrus Mugo, who are going to be co-presenting about the process for writing and disseminating policy briefs, and specifically how to engage policymakers in that process. Before we jump into this, I'm going to introduce a little bit about BIRCH. Many of you are members of BIRCH, have attended these webinars before, but some of you, I'm sure, are new to BIRCH, the UW Behavioral Center for HIV. This is a 4-year NIMH-funded developmental AIDS research center. And this is a collaboration between several different departments at the University of Washington: global health, psychiatry, psychology, and School of Social Work. And this center supports mental health and behavioral and social science research to end the HIV epidemic. And you can see on the slides the link to the BIRCH Center. I encourage you to learn more about the center, what it does, the various different types of funding available, and support and development. BIRCH's mission is to catalyze multidisciplinary research on innovation, impactful and equitable interventions to promote integration of behavioral health and HIV prevention and treatment across the lifespan to end the HIV epidemic. And within BIRCH, there are several different cores: the administrative core led by Dr. Susan Graham, as well as a methods core led by Dr. Brian Flaherty, the integrated care core led by my colleague Lydia Chwastiak, and the developmental core led by Dr. Patrick Rue, who there are many folks who are around to support the various types of research and career development needs that you have. So please reach out to BIRCH. In addition to BIRCH's sponsorship, we have several joining partners that are sponsoring this event and the whole series related to translating evidence to policy: CFAR, RAISE, iTech, Global Watch, WISE, LAPIS, the Implementation Science Program, and Global Mental Health. Thanks so much for spreading the word about this wonderful event and offering co-sponsorship. I want to mention that today is the third of 4 webinars, and the 4th webinar is coming up in person on December 3rd at HRC, and Leah Wen is going to be leading this session about using storytelling in translating evidence to policy. I hope that you will join for this. Please note that space is limited. RSVP is required. Please secure your seat here. We're really looking forward to this in-person session and hearing some feedback from folks and considering having a virtual one as well to expand the reach of this. So thank you so much, Leah, for leading the 4th in this series. And now I have the incredible privilege of introducing 2 of my absolute favorite colleagues who are going to be doing our 3rd session today about how to develop and disseminate policy briefs. So I'm going to introduce first Dr. Nancy Ngumbau, who is a medical doctor and has her master's in public health from the University of Washington. Dr. Nancy is an implementation science doctoral candidate at the University of Nairobi. She also is in the Department of Research and Programs at Kenyatta National Hospital, where she often serves as acting head. She has a really broad portfolio of research. Nancy and I have been colleagues for I don't know how many years now, Nancy, and your projects range from pre-exposure prophylaxis to mental health, to the integration of HIV and non-communicable diseases, to women's cancer, and many training programs. And Nancy has been doing a lot around leading the dissemination of research findings. And she's joined by Dr. Cyrus Mugo, who many of you may have seen in a related BIRCH event a few weeks ago. And Dr. Mugo is a research scientist also at Kenyatta National Hospital. And Cyrus, we've worked together for, I think it's 13 years since we were young people. And Cyrus is a medical doctor, has an MPH in global health and a PhD in epidemiology, where he trained at the University of Washington, and has a broad portfolio that spans HIV through the life cycle, and now is really focusing in on mental health for various populations, and is the PI of several different awards, including some BIRCH funding. And I'm really overjoyed to have these 2 presenting here today. For our session today, Nancy will present about how policy briefs are generated and trained on within the Kenyatta National Hospital program, and the two of them will take questions at the end of today, at the end of the session today. And at the end of the session, we will invite you to fill an evaluation to let us know how this went, what you want to learn more about, and how we can increase the reach of these sessions going forward. So without further ado, I will pass over to Dr. Nancy and Dr. Cyrus. Thank you so much all for being here today. And thanks, Nancy and Cyrus, for leading us.
And today we are going to talk about writing and disseminating policy briefs. And we are going to share our experience here in Kenya at Kenyatta National Hospital, how we do it, and basically the lessons learned and some of the gaps and questions we are grappling with. So when we began this issue about policy briefs, we realized that we have quite a lot of data from our research. We have so much in what we know from our research, but then this is not translating into policy and decision making. And so the question that we had and the need that we had here is, how do we translate what we have done over the years in research and then make them policy? And we were cognizant that there are many actors, there are many perspectives, there are many issues, especially in terms of the policymakers. We have many questions, power dynamics, and basically many players and interests. And that's how we began this process of just figuring out how we can be able to disseminate the policy brief. And the question that we had is, we have relevant research evidence, but this is not accessible and it's not given to our policymakers in a timely manner. And we sought to just try to understand, okay, so what are the issues? And these issues have been brought up severally. There is information overload. So we are not the only, as researchers, sometimes we think we are the only people influencing the space, but the policymakers have very many people that they speak to. So there's the research aspect, there's social media, there's the population, the community, and even what they believe, what they read. So that's one of the barriers in terms of the information overload. There's also reduced awareness and competencies in finding and evaluating or using certain evidence. So for us as researchers, we revere systematic reviews and we say this is where we get the information. But then for policymakers, so how do you get that systematic review about that particular issue? And the issues that they're grappling with are quite a number of issues. So reduced awareness in terms of how to just access this information. And then there are differences in priorities, differences in deadlines, differences in the way, like shifts in government. And this is also becomes a problem. So our thought and the need we're trying to address is, how do we make our research results accessible, and how do we begin to facilitate policy discussion and improve the use of research evidence in policy making? So when we started, that was the goal that we had. And we decided we settled on a policy brief, and we're like, okay, so for policymakers, we need something that's concise. So the policy brief seemed as an option. Why? Because it's a concise summary of a particular issue. And within the summary, you also have the policy options. You present the policy options that you can deal with. And then you also have specific recommendations on the best option to address the problem. Well, I think it's not just us, but all policymakers don't have a lot of time. So we're thinking, how do we best, with a minimal amount of time, best engage? And we thought, okay, a policy brief would be one of the ways. And I've attached examples of just, these are not ours, but just policy briefs that you can find. And a policy brief is basically a vehicle that can be used to provide policy advice using research evidence, and particularly to a non-specialized audience. And the way we have been doing our policy briefs is making it analytic, objective, and fact-based. so that we try to inform decisions or just to motivate action within our policymakers. And I think one of the things to think about in terms of when we're thinking about policymakers, in our setting, we just don't look at the people within the Ministry of Health only as the policymakers. We actually look at the heads of departments within our institution, the CEO, just basically someone who's at a position to make any change. We term them as the policymakers. So our policy briefs go to various levels of policymakers. So we can go to the departments that's relevant, just the head of department or the CEO, or now the county and now the national policymakers. And the reason why we selected a policy brief, we settled on a policy brief, is it's a less intimidating information packaging document. We recommend a one-page that is very easy to read, so that it can promote synthesis of research evidence by the policymakers. And part of the reason why we thought like policy brief. So within a policy brief, you have enough of the background, enough of the problem synthesis just to understand the problem. Within the policy brief, you can describe the urgency of the situation. And you can provide information about the policies that are there, like the alternative to the existing policy, or evidence to just suggest one recommendation. And over time, we've seen that it can be used to stimulate decision making. And usually these are the tips we give to everyone that we work with. And I'll take you through the process of how we actually get there. But we recommend and insist, even as we are reviewing the policy brief, that they need to be short and to the point. And the idea is just to ensure that you focus on the problem and the issue and not the details. It should be based on firm evidence. So research, a research study that was conducted rigorously. The idea is to focus on meanings and not methods. So you look at what is found and what is recommended, and not the details of the methodology in terms of you did which analysis, or not those details, but just what was found, what is recommended, and looking at the big picture, and you to draw conclusions that are more generally applicable. So before the policy brief dissemination, as I'd said, we usually ask, so you have the policymaker, and I think I've defined the policymaker, the head of department, whoever the person is at making the decision. The questions we ask is, who am I writing this policy brief to? How knowledgeable are they about that topic? And you realize that policymakers they're diverse. So they range from people who are well knowledgeable to people who may not have any knowledge within that topic. We also try to evaluate how open are they to the message that you want to give. And we actually reach out and try and see, okay, is this something that you'd be willing to think about? So how open are you? What questions, what concerns do they have? What questions do they still need to answer, and what are their interests? And I think the key point that we keep insisting is that, one, policymakers are busy, and two, they are probably not specialists in our area. And I keep saying, like, imagine the president of Kenya. The president of Kenya is not a research scientist, is not in implementation science, is not maybe in your field, and you want to communicate to him. So what do? You need to understand how knowledgeable he is, how open he is to the message. Is this a question he has? And what is his interest and concerns? So, so what exactly do we do? And here I'll delve into the process that we do. So we usually first identify all the research that has actually been done. And this doesn't have to be only like the NIH awarded research. We usually even have seed grants that are awarded within the institution. And we just collect the information of what is happening within the ground, what is the topic about. And one of the things we have made it as mandatory is, especially for the people who get seed grants within our institution, they have to develop a policy brief. And that way it sort of becomes a mandate for people to even learn how to do the policy briefs and people to start thinking critically about their work. And then we identify the target audience. And by this, I mean, if we try and see, an example is if the study is on adolescents, then is it on adolescent HIV? What area? If it's on adolescent HIV, we look at the program manager for the adolescents within NASCOP. If it's dermatology, we look for that audience and the policymaker within that space to be able to make sure that our policy brief is relevant to the target audience. And then we try and align with the research agenda that is there within the policies. And I've actually put screenshots of what we do. So we create the list using the title, and we usually even send abstracts like to the Ministry of Health, the Division of Research, and we outline the title and the abstract, and we ask them, is this something you'd be interested in? Just provide comments of, in terms of that list, what you'd be interested in, what is your comments? Do you see it as a potential for a policy brief? And they give us very good feedback. Maybe I can read the one for the rational use for antibiotics. They'll say it's a well-written abstract. We should upload it to the Kenya Health and Research Observatory. And they give feedback of where the gap is. Like the antibiotic use guidelines is available, it's not being adhered to. And the question, and they say that, yes, this is something we would need an evidence brief for. I know I've put the ones for yes, but there are others they say, no, this is not something we'd be interested in, but then they tell us, okay, redirect this to this organization or redirect this there. So we try to identify the target audience and align with the research agenda. The other unique thing I think we do is we get the owners of the research to actually develop the policy brief and present it to the Ministry of Health or to the policymakers themselves. And we do this in a way that we critique. It's sort of like a didactic training session on how to write a policy brief. And we also allow the policymakers to give their feedback and just discuss the policy brief. And we found that this is actually it becomes a very interesting platform that many people join. Because people want to know how to write the policy briefs. And then also the policymakers get an opportunity to say how they want their policy briefs to be written. And this helps in terms of just having the conversation of how to move the work forward. And I think one of the lessons that we've learned is that the format is very critical. Usually, again, policymakers are very busy people. They don't have a lot of time to read many pages of documents. And we have come up with a template or a way that we request people to be able to write it. And it aligns to how other people are writing. But one of the things is there's no one-size-fits-all approach to writing policy briefs. However, we just request, particularly the people who are developing the policy briefs, to just do a title, an executive summary, an introduction of what the research is about, have a body of research, and we'll go into all these things, and then the conclusion and policy recommendation. And on the right to my screen is where we shared one of the policy briefs we developed for a cluster randomized clinical trial, where we're looking at risk-based versus universal PrEP delivery. And this is one of the policy briefs that that was well liked within the ministry, because it was concise and just direct to the point. And we can even share that later. And now we go through with the attendees and even with the policymakers, all the sections of the policy brief. And the policy brief, as advised, the title, it should be short, and the advice should be short, something catchy. Ideally should be less than 12 words. It should grab the reader's attention. And usually here we even discuss with the policy makers what title would you want to have on the policy brief, and the person who developed the policy brief actually gets feedback on the title. It should include relevant keywords or phrases that stick in the mind, and you're allowed to use a question as part of your policy brief title, and it should be accurate and to the point. And one of the, I just attached a few titles that we have used. Can PrEP health talks, communication aids, and PrEP dispensing in MCH make it easier to deliver PrEP? And one that Dr. Mugo developed in terms of transition from adolescent to adult care for adolescents with HIV in Kenya. So basically, the policy brief title should just be short and catchy. In terms of the executive summary, one of the feedback that is given is it should be, since it's the first thing that the reader would see, it should distill the essence of the brief. It should have everything that you're saying in your brief in a few bullet points or a short paragraph or two. And this provides an overview for the busy reader, for our policymakers who are busy readers. And the recommendation for this is actually to write it last, after you've written all the other sections and you have a concise idea of your entire policy brief, is when we write the executive summary. And the take home here is, what are the main points you want policymakers to get, even if they read nothing else? So if they just read that executive summary, what do you want the policymakers to get out of it? And particularly, what will they run home with? And one of the things is that the executive summary should just reel in someone to be able to read it. And then we go to the introduction. And as I'd said, we discuss, so if someone is presenting their policy brief, we discuss each and every section. We read the title, then the person gets feedback from the policymaker, from the people within the room. This is how the title should be, the executive summary, add this, take this out. And then now we go to the introduction. And here we request people to now define why they are writing the brief and express the urgency and the importance of the topic to the audience. So this is where you say the rationale or the why for this policy brief. Why is this a problem? Why is this important? Why should we be concerned about what we are reading? It should describe the key questions of your analysis and your conclusions. And it should clearly convey the argument that you're setting up, and it should sort of form a preamble to the rest of the document and leave the readers with a clear sense of what the research is and entice them to continue reading. It's sort of like the way we are thinking about an elevator speech. So if the policymaker is there with you, you need to be able to convey in a way that it entices them to read, but they still see the urgency and the importance of the topic. And then we go to the overview. And here is where a lot of us scientists struggle a bit. And I think this is where we spend a bit of time with the attendees and even with the policymakers. So here it should be the summary of the facts to describe the issues, the context, and the research methods. And in the body is where you're talking about your approach and the results section. We need to structure the text in a logical manner. Ensure that you don't make the reader have to go back and forth and try to figure out what is connecting this, which paragraph am I in. So just structure it in a logical manner. Here we encourage people to use more headings and more subheadings, color if you can, bold some of the things, put diagrams, tables, figures. The idea is to keep the paragraphs short and restrict it to a single idea. Restrict it to the message that you want to give to the policymaker. And then paint a general picture of the research findings before moving into the specifics. And the idea here is to connect your data to your policy advice and concrete realities. The reason why I say here is where we struggle as scientists is because we tend to use a lot of jargon in our writing, in terms of our manuscripts. When we're even talking to each other, we use jargon that people don't necessarily know, especially if they are not in the medical field. So here is where we advise people to avoid jargon and overly technical language. So the practice that we do when we are, before even the attendees present their policy briefs, we tell them, take your policy brief and read it to your children. If your children understand it, then it means you've written a very good policy brief. Like if a 9-year-old can be able to understand it, that is perfect. If they cannot understand it, you need to step back and try and figure out how do you write it in a way that can be understood. So we try and give that practice to people so that we can be able to a bit simplify. But then again, it boils back to who your target audience is. There's some of the policymakers who prefer to have the numbers, and they've actually expressed, I want to see the numbers, I want to see the p-values, and that's fine once you understand your audience. But sometimes we also deal with policymakers who are not research scientists, they're not in the medical field. Yes, they influence decisions in the medical field, but they are not there. So once we identify and we see that the policymaker we are reaching out to is not, take your policy brief, read it, and if it makes sense, then now it can be able to be read by the policymaker and begin a conversation. And then we go to the conclusion and the policy recommendation. Here is where you draw the link between your findings and your recommendation. So you examine the implications of your research and the recommendations that have been produced by the research. And the recommendation is sort of like a call to action. And we advise guys to state the recommendation clearly and in a way that is easy to understand. It should be precise, relevant, credible, and with feasible next steps. And then we ask people to make the recommendations easy to find. So even if it's within your document, make it in a way that it's in a title, someone can just glance at it and see, okay, this is the policy recommendation. And then keep it short. If you put 10 recommendations, we still go back to the challenge that the policymakers have. It becomes information overload. We suggest 1, 2, 3, 4 recommendations. And if you just have 1 or 2, that's fine. And that helps in terms of even of the discussion and even the policymaker understanding exactly what you want to talk about. So keep it short and then make them realistic in your context. So what works at KNH may not work in the hospital next to us. It may not work for the ministry. So find a way you make your recommendation is realistic. And one of the advice we keep giving is you do not have to put your recommendations at the end. The recommendations can actually come immediately after your executive summary. You can put the recommendations at that point. It's not necessarily that it is at the end. It just, the policy brief is to capture the audience that you're in and trying to figure out how do I engage with this policymaker. Okay, so I'll go on now to the lessons that we have learned. And I think I mentioned one of them in terms of not all studies require policy briefs. And sometimes that's the case. And maybe it forms part of the scientific data that will be developed into something bigger, and maybe just needs to be at a database and submitted to a journal and can be developed further. But not everything we produce require policy briefs. And we actually get this feedback from the policymakers themselves, depending on their agenda at that time. We've also learned that it is an easy tool to use to engage policymakers. And with a model where the people the people who did the study present their policy briefs, and we are using that as a platform to train, and the policymakers look at it, say, okay, this doesn't make sense. And it even stirs up a conversation of, you've answered this question, but not fully, and I need something else to just back this up. And it becomes sort of like a conversation, a place also to allow people to network with their policymakers, to just bridge that gap. And then the other thing we are learning is that the policy brief is only a piece of paper, and it can't do anything on its own. So as much as we develop these policy briefs, we need to engage with the policymakers. It's just a piece of paper until you engage with the policymakers, until it's translated to the guidelines and it moves from someone's desk to the population. But then I think one of the things we are grappling with as we are growing and trying to figure out the next steps is, so we have disseminated this policy brief. So what happens after that? How do we move beyond the conversation we've had with the policymakers and giving it to them and getting it to have population impact? Because all of our research, the evidence is strong, and it produces something that should be consumed by the population. So how do we move this policy brief and just the policy space and into population impact? I think I've come to the end of the presentation. Thank you so much. We can take any questions from them.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was brilliant. And I would be so glad to facilitate any question and answer here. Yay, seeing lots of claps and kudos and appreciation. Why don't we have folks that have questions, please raise your hand, and then I'll invite you to come off mute if you can. If you're not in a position to speak your question, if you are willing to put it into the chat box, and I'll read those out. Anyone have a question that they'd like to ask? As people are thinking of theirs, I had a thought, and I was curious about how, as you were describing, Nancy, the funding that comes through KNH, because KNH not only conducts research, but also funds seed research or small research within departments, the requirement that all funded research have a policy brief. How did you come across that idea, and how has that kind of contributed generally to making more policy briefs happen? It seems like your department is really leading in the translation of research into policy.
Yeah, I can take that question. So I think it's more in terms of evaluation of, okay, we have been giving the seed grants, we have a lot of this data, and we wanted to move that we have our evidence that is consumed. And we did not begin by thinking about even the Ministry of Health. The beginning was, how can we make sure it is consumed within the different departments? Because the studies that are, the seed grants funds researchers who do research within their departments, but you realize that there's evidence that's sitting in books. So the question began, how do we make sure that it's consumed within just the departments first, even before we even move out to the Ministry of Health? And I think it's more the same way if you get an NIH grant, you have to do an RPPR or something. We then just put it and said, okay, we need to do the policy briefs, and the policy briefs need to be taken to your heads of department, and then from there, they at least review and see the results and see if that can be used within the department. And then I think part of the mandate also with our department was how then do we disseminate this to the ministry? And we began the engagement with the Ministry of Health, and they were surprisingly open to it, and they'd say, okay, for the seed grants that you have, send us a list of all those research ideas, and we'll tell you which ones are of interest to us, which ones are not. And through that now we've grown. I think it's more a step-by-step process, just within the space that you're in, how can you make that change and then now move forward? So that's how we've done it.
Thanks, Nancy. Let's have a question from first Leah and then Judy after that.
Thank you so much. This has been such an incredible presentation and so much really specific and valuable information. I think you answered my first question. I kind of missed what that interface between I was curious how you were getting feedback on which research policymakers wanted to get policy briefs on. I think I was maybe multitasking at that point and missed that little mention, but it sounds like that was just through a natural extension of your relationship with the Ministry of Health that they offered to look at that. Is that right?
Yeah, I think, yes, the natural extension and also within like our networks, the policymakers we interact with. Yeah, just reaching out to them, trying to see if that is something that is within their agenda, something they need answers to, and just disseminating it now.
That iterative conversation seems like such a so useful, and I think the back and forth and like an open conversation between people that are informing policy and relationship building is one of the things that I found is really important in my work. I'm curious, what is the follow-up after after you've delivered the policy briefs? I think you kind of alluded to that at the end of the talk, but what do you do? Are there in-person meetings? Kind of how do you follow up on these briefs?
Okay, so the meetings that we have are virtual because trying to get the policymakers within an in-person meeting sometimes is hectic. It's a virtual 1-hour meeting that we hold. We tend to typically do it early morning because that's when they are available. And since it's virtual, anyone who's interested in developing a policy brief would join, and then the policy makers, we invite quite a number of them of different levels to be able to join, and within a topic that they're interested in. If it's a dermatology study, I mean, someone within HIV might not be interested in that. And then now start having the conversation, allow the person who's developed the policy brief to share their policy brief, and we go section by section. This is the title, does it make sense? This is the summary, does it make sense? And we get to hear from the policymakers and also from just people within the room. And sometimes it generates into like a research idea for like the next steps. I think now is where we are trying to figure out once that's done, and the attendee, like the person who developed the policy brief, we get a lot of comments. And after the comments, they work on the policy brief based on the recommendations. And then within the department now, we disseminate it now to like now the relevant policymaker. We do it officially through email. And we've been trying to also like follow up and see where the policy brief is, how it's impacting. But I think that's one of the areas we are trying to grow and see, okay, so after we've disseminated, and that's the question I think I also put on the slide. So after we've disseminated our policy brief, we're trying to figure out, so how do we, what do we do next? And it's now a question we are grappling with. And I think any ideas that we can implement also would be welcome. But so far, that's how we've just journeyed in terms of the policy brief.
Thanks so much. I'd love to talk more about that at some point.
Sounds like a good conversation that and group to start with. Let's hear questions from Judy, then Robin, then Sarah, and then there are 2 questions in the chat that I'll read out from Temi and Yanfeng. Go ahead, Judy.
Okay, thank you, Nancy, for that presentation. Now, if I would like to write a policy brief that's relevant to Kenya, do you have a link to our database where I can access previous policy briefs so that to avoid any duplication of a policy brief?
That is a very good idea, Judy. We shall implement it. We don't have one yet, but I think it's quite a good idea, and we have a repository, and I think creating a database for the previous policy briefs, it's a very good idea, actually.
Thank you.
Maybe to add just one thing to that, because the policy brief should emanate from unique work. And so, yes, there's benefit in knowing that there was a policy brief on something, a topic, but the assumption should be that the work that you're doing, the research and also the implementation work that you're doing and your observations, lessons learned, would be unique and would inform. And so I would actually encourage, even if you're seeing a policy brief that talks about a certain topic, that you actually go ahead and write yours and give the unique perspective with the lessons learned and let it compete, let the ideas compete at the table of the policymaker.
Thank you.
I love that advice. I think that's great. Robin, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for that great presentation and the very detailed slides as well. My question is about what you mentioned regarding not providing too much detail on the methodology and getting bogged down in the jargon. And I fully understand the benefit of that. I'm just wondering, in light of that, how do you strike a balance between not doing that, but at the same time conveying that your research is rigorous and that this is sound evidence? Because as you mentioned, policymakers receive a lot of information. How do you make it clear that this was done in a rigorous way without going into too much detail?
Yeah, and I think one of the lessons that we've actually learned over time is understanding your audience is really, really critical. We've actually gone into one of the presentations where there was a policy brief and we made it without jargon, and the policymaker was like, I want the numbers, I need the numbers, I need the p-values, I need to understand the rigor. And I think that also made us take a step back to just understand, okay, we need to be able to understand who we are talking to, who and what their what their qualifications, their interest is. And as I said, there's no one size fit all for policy briefs. And I think that's where it's a bit of a challenge, because you see, like when we're writing manuscripts, it's the introduction, the methods, the results, and the results we want. Some policymakers prefer having the numbers, some don't, and just now having that engagement to just understand your audience, understand their question, understand also their urgency. And that is now what helps us to know, like even in terms of advising someone who's writing to a particular policy brief, would be like, for this particular person, they need they need the rigor, they need to understand the rigor, they need the data. And for this other particular person, the data should, like, you should avoid a bit of jargon. And that's, I think, what we are learning so far, because I keep saying that the contexts are different with people, the policymakers are different. Yeah, so that's one of the things we've put in place, just trying to understand the audience.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to add something small on that, just 2 things. So yes, knowing the audience is important because, for example, our HIV program here in Kenya, they're scientists. Some of them are implementation scientists. You know, Sarah was. They're just so these are people. When I'm doing a policy brief to them, I have to prove that this was done well. But I have learned for other groups, it's my credibility as the researcher that sells the message. So what I will do is actually package myself, and I'm a good scientist. I do very good research. I give you very good research and results. But then this is a message I'm giving. So it's not even the methods that carry the day. It's the credibility of the researcher. And so the next frontier, of course, is for us now to do the dissemination science to try and establish what works where. This Washington University, St. Louis, they have a very nice paper that they published a few months ago on different policy briefs and the impact they had and on the messaging and so this is the kind of work I think we should start doing, especially here in the low and middle income countries. Sometimes we do say maybe all that doesn't matter. What matters is their money. But I think as you do the science, I think we'll establish what really works for all these different populations of policymakers.
I think that the paper that I put in the chat box might be the one that you're referring to, Cyrus. And this is actually some of Leah's colleagues. I got so jazzed when I saw this paper coming out, some empiric research about what works, and agree wholeheartedly about the importance of doing dissemination research. And I think, Sarah Masuko, you had a question, but I see your hand has gone down. Did you have a question you wanted to add?
Just putting it down so that I don't forget to put it down. But yeah, great presentation. Thank you so much, Nancy. And thank you, Cyrus, for all your comments and all the work that you're doing. I mean, it's amazing work. Coming from the other end where I've been doing policy work and now doing research and doing a lot different things now, I think it's really nice. I just, maybe to Robin's question, typically what I have seen and what we do is we have a one-pager, which is a policy brief, but we do a packet for our study and for everything, which includes all the details that are in the study, the various studies. And for us, we will, I would say, when you're on the receiving end, when you're giving the policymaker the policy brief, one of the things that you have to think about is they have many other things that they are looking at, and maybe other people that have done this. So making it simpler enough, like I don't expect to have 5 policy briefs from one study. I suggest that you put everything in one, and not everything that is in the study needs to be in a policy brief as well. So what are the things, like you have to take time to say, these are all our findings and these are all the things that are there, but probably this is the most important, because it's not possible to have everything. So we find 5, 6 things in a study, and it's great, and we want all of it to be taken on, but it's not going to happen that way. So just having the one most important thing first, then getting the attention. So I say policy making happens in stages. So it doesn't happen with a policy brief. I can assure you it doesn't happen with a policy brief. But I thought I wanted to answer a little bit around what Nancy was asking. What next, and how do you do that? The first thing I would say is that if the policy brief is the first time and you're engaging with a policymaker, that's not going to work. Like it's too late. It's too late if the policy brief is the first thing that they are seeing. So having it earlier and having a life cycle approach to the engagement with that then puts you at a better spot. And then for you, as you think about this, I think it's really identifying the avenues where policy is translated, like policy is needed. So right now, for example, the guideline is under review. Yeah. And all the researches that are ongoing are now feeding back into, for HIV, for example, doing that. So right now we're doing something for social network services. We're doing something for HIV testing. We're doing something for these specific areas. And providing your research at this time becomes an opportune time for you to, to get into the process. So timing to me is the most important thing here, and having that conversation. And then, like Claire said, relationships. I don't think you're going to make it with a paper. I knew Angeli. I know I could call on Angeli. I could call on somebody else, and just that relationship, and that you're always, they know you. Like, if they can identify you as a researcher, as Cyrus was saying, that you are the person and this is what you're doing, for them to call on you when they need some information. So I would say focus on the relationship, and then have the meetings now. I think it's more of engaging one-to-one as opposed to a meeting where there is, especially a virtual meeting. I'm telling you, I don't think that's the right ideal method to engage. I think a one-on-one would be more, after the virtual, do a one-on-one.
Sarah, thank you so much for that. And this reminds me that many, many years ago, you gave a talk at KRTC about the life cycle approach for engaging with policymakers, not just dissemination, but the whole engagement process that you just articulated there. And it might be worth checking in to see whether another session like that could be revived in the coming time, because I really appreciate the point you make about the life cycle approach. Nancy or Cyrus, did you want to mention anything on that? And then I have 2 more questions in the chat box I'd love to get to if we have time. Great. Well, we had a question from Temi about how to deliver a policy brief to a policymaker that is anti-science or has a strong conflict of interest. And then I'll mention another question just so that you have these, since we're running a bit short on time. Yanfang asks, great presentation. Would you disseminate the brief via social media? So questions about anti-science policymakers or folks with conflicts of interest, and then whether you would consider dissemination through social media. Thanks.
Nancy, you'll take one of those.
I think I can attempt the anti-science one, and then let me give you the difficult one for social media. I think one of the things we have realized, and over time, is the idea of well, even if the policymaker is anti-science, we keep knocking the door, because that's the person who we still need to talk to, and we still need to have a conversation with. So we keep knocking the door, but then framing, and as Sarah had said, and Sarah has said, Sarah Masiko, is sometimes the approach is packaging yourself. The approach is the institution. The approach is what their interest particularly is in. And that's, I think, part of the engagement, stakeholder policy and policymaker engagement is, if the policymaker is anti-science, so what is their interest? What is their question? Because there are policymakers for a reason. There's a particular reason that they were given that particular office or that space where they can change something. So they might be anti-science, but they care about the population. They might be anti-science, but they care about economic growth, and that becomes the doorway in. And now figuring out how to just coin your policy brief based on their interest, their question, and packaging whatever that piques their interest. Sometimes, as Sarah had said, sometimes it's not the policy brief itself. Sometimes it's the institution or you or whatever piques their interest.
Yeah, just to add on to that, yeah, absolutely. Just as Nancy mentioned, and this is what this paper actually says. This is a very great read. It's a paper I've read a few times. This paper from WashU. So, the information that you put in there is a cocktail of whatever is interesting to different people. So, whether it's a question of whether you will be talking about, do you know your people, the people who have elected you, or people who are interested in, or it's the business people who are interested in this kind of thing, or the person is minds about the environment or something like that. So they could be anti-science, and those are difficult people to deal with generally. So maybe you might, if you can avoid them, maybe you'll avoid them as a scientist. Usually that is what we do. We avoid anti-science people. But if you really want to have impact, I think you'll persist and look for nice ways to package your message. Maybe it matters. I think these are the questions we need to ask in the dissemination research now we need to do. Does that approach really yield results anyway? Or just the powers, the hierarchical structure is what really influences the decision to take up policies or not? I think those are important questions we need to answer in the next few years. And social media, yes, but I can't say that this is something that I've done, but I think it's something viable. I've seen people engage with policies on social media. I do not have a good framework of how to do that yet. And so it's something that I hope to learn in the coming days.
I want to thank everyone for their fantastic questions. I really want to especially thank Dr. Nancy and Dr. Cyrus for being with us today for this. This webinar was so well attended and so engaging and such a spectacular presentation. So thank you. This has been a real pleasure to be part of, and thank you so much for being with us. So one more round of applause. And we thank everyone for their time and attention. Please look forward to the fourth and final so far session in our series that's coming up, and keep your eyes peeled for maybe more sessions in the coming years. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful Thursday.